Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Yana this evening for its monthly town hall. My name is Benjamin Hernandez. I'm a current junior in Trumbull College at Yale. I'll be stepping in as Yana's guest host for tonight's discussion on the climate crisis. And I'll be stepping into Ken and Nadomi's mighty role here at Yana. And to begin, I'd like to reiterate Yana's mission and a core theme of the nonprofit. So as Ken likes to say, Yana also stands for You Are Not Alone. And well, I'm glad to say that that's exactly how I felt the summer after my first year at Yale when I interned at Yana. And under the mentorship of Ken and former executive director Rachel Littman, I got a glimpse of what it was like to work in the nonprofit space and in social impact. And so a core theme of Yana is that we operate from generation to generation. And when you join Yana, you're joining a community of Yale alumni, family, and friends committed to working together to change lives through a multi-generational approach. For Gen Z students and young alums like myself, Yana strives to connect us with internships, fellowships, and mentoring. For millennials and Gen X, or those at the peak or approaching the peak of their career, Yana aims to help them access resources to scale their organization with human or financial resources or other best practices. And for the older alumni and friends and family, Yana is also here to help find curated ways to give back effectively by way of serving on nonprofit boards or by serving as an advisor or consultant. And so Yana currently hosts about 8,000 members. And if you'd like to be a supporting member, please consider a recurring monthly contribution of $5 to $10 a month. And you can find that information on our donation page on our website. Perfect. Well, enough of that. I'd now like to before introducing our speakers for tonight, I'd also like to introduce here our new executive director, Kristen Urquiza, who is, and sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, but class of '03.
You did it well. Thanks, Ben. And so excited to be here with you all today. I'm based in California, so not in the room, but in the virtual space. And we'll be supporting Ben for any questions from the online to our speakers to make sure that that goes really smoothly. And a couple of just things I want to share before jumping into the program today, in addition to just thanking everyone for being here, to our guest speakers, for this really exciting and important conversation that we're about to have, but also to thank Ben, not only for stepping into this role as guest host this evening, but also we are really excited about you on the Yale campus chapter in our second semester of having a Yana campus chapter, and been leading up that work. So we are excited to support you in the coming weeks and months as that work continues. And I encourage everyone in the room to make sure that you connect with Ben and see if there are ways in which you can support the campus chapter as it's getting up and running. The second announcement that I have, folks should know, but just to reinforce, is that we're having our upcoming conference and awards luncheon right at the Yale Club coming up on October 25th. So mark the date. We hope you all can join us. It's going to be a jam-packed day of really engaging content, both in kind of exploring some pressing issues, like how to leverage augmented or AI towards increasing your impact and advancing your mission, to other topics of incredible importance in skills sharing, from fundraising, good governance, and beyond. We have a very limited number of tickets, and we will sell out. So I just want to make sure to plug, if you're planning to attend, to reserve your ticket sooner versus later, so that we can make sure that you're able to join us. Last year, I joined the conference myself for the first time in person, and I walked away calling up my partner and saying two things. One, I think I found my Yale people, and two, this is the best conference that I've ever been to. I was inspired. I had tangible takeaways that I took back to the nonprofit that I was working with to employ. And I also had expanded my network with some really incredible individuals that are part of this community, that not only have this Yale identity, but also this deeper desire to ensure that the efforts that we are putting into our work and beyond are giving back to the broader community. So just wanted to have a little plug for get your conference tickets, because if you're planning to come, we will sell out. I want to make sure that those are reserved. And that's all I have. Ben, I'm going to pass it back to you. And thank you all so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you, Kristen. So now I'd like to introduce our two guest speakers for tonight. And that's Peter Boyd and Sarah Charlop-Powers. Charlop-Powers. So yeah, Peter's a lecturer at the Yale School of Management and the School of the Environment, as well as a member of the UN's Race to Zero campaign, the world's largest coalition of non-state actors taking immediate action to have global emissions by 2030. Sarah, class of 09 at the Yale School of the Environment, is co-founder and executive director of Natural Areas Conservancy, which is a nonprofit dedicated to managing New York City's 20,000 acres of forests and wetlands. And before we jump into this discussion, I'd also like to thank Yale Blue Green for sponsoring tonight's event. So my first question here is actually for Peter. I was wondering, Peter, if you could tell me, what are the macro trends in climate change that we're seeing at present, and what are the major impacts of these trends?
Yeah, I mean, big question. And hi, everybody. So I've got the privilege of getting the question just a little bit in advance to say, like, you're going to be asking me about it, that sort of impacts. And I thought I would, for this audience that I presume is at minimum climate interested, and probably a maximum looking around the room, climate experts. And so with that, with all of us on, I imagine, the concern side of the house, if you take the Yale program of climate change communication, we're all up in that upper band of the six Americas on what we think about it. So I was going to twist the question slightly in a sort of my favorite stories to connect impacts with life, and in a way that gets across the trends, that also helps us have better conversations, especially in this country, but actually it applies across anywhere else. So my first one, in terms of, like, if we take the sort of almost like the macro pieces to talk about, I think it's climate change, like as in the global temperature and its effects, the social piece of that, the sort of the effects on people and the effects on nature. And if we take sort of three maybe stories to help you sort of maybe unpack those. The first one on climate change, you've seen sort of scare stuff everywhere, I imagine, on sort of the heat, where we're going on these things. I would try and get people that are interested in the data to almost like both go global and local. Show Your Stripes, for instance, is a really interesting site, showyourstripes.info, where you just sort of see, you can pick out your region, the whole of China, the whole of Europe, Connecticut, or the world, and just go to sort of see what is happening near you, what is happening in the globe on deviations from the national average of temperature. And you can get into that very sort of almost like gutturally and quickly and colorfully, because blue is cold and red is hot. And you can see where that's going. Another good one is Climate Spiral, which is just this sort of annual temperatures, January to December, going out from the Industrial Revolution, going out towards our safe thresholds on humanity, 1.5 and 2 degrees, but you can see it as it comes out to sort of 2023. So with that in mind, that doesn't really, the scare tactics don't work with people that either don't believe to start with or don't want to see that. So my favorite one on climate change is, and I hat tip to another Yale alum, Neil Yo at 1.5, for this one about like a 10-minute drive. That if you think about what we're trying to protect, it is a very thin layer around this planet. Such that it's about the width of the lacquer of a globe if you had a nice one in your library. So thinking about this as more intuitively and humanly, like what would it take to drive 10 minutes? You don't go very far. But if you aimed your car upwards and drove your car up 10 minutes, you would get to the limit of the functioning atmosphere that we are actually trying to protect. So I think that brings home for people this sort of burning of fossil fuels, pollution, etc. It's not going into this unending sort of seas, an unending sort of universe. It's going into this very, very thin blanket around the planet. And when it heats up, the heat doesn't then escape when it gets thicker. So that would be my thought on sort of climate change. And we can cover any or more of questions on sort of on it. But it's like story one, drive 10 minutes up. That's what we're protecting. Story number two on people. I think it's just it seems increasingly obvious, and I think the stats are, I've got it here, so lower income countries are 4.5 times more likely to suffer catastrophic events than higher income countries. So it's almost like the Industrial Revolution that has caused all this, and other countries are trying to develop, they're currently sort of almost like being kept down and indeed catastrophically affected by this climate change. So my story too on this kind of social inequality is probably a cocktail glass. So if you think of a cocktail glass, and this is, I think, an Oxfam data, and I can get any visuals to the crew for afterwards. But if you think of a cocktail glass where the top 10% of income generating people on the planet are responsible for half of the world's emissions annually, top 10%. So if you think it is one of those lovely posh cocktail glasses that's not very stable on a table. And then if you think of it as it goes down the stem, the bottom 50% of income earners on the planet in their different grades and deciles are responsible for the 10% of the world's emissions. So it's almost like the effects are being sort of felt by this bottom half of the stem, but they're causing 10%, and this top 10% are causing half. And then my third one is just what would you do with a human that is doing this stuff, this human race? And my third story, I think, is I like this one as imagine a 46-year-old company. The world is 4.6 billion years old. So let's call it 46 years. It's a going concern. And I think most of us have maybe worked for an organization that is in and around that, younger, older, founded one, a bit younger. But that idea of like, it's a 46-year-old going concern called the planet. And then 4 hours ago, we took on a new employee staff member called the human. And then an hour ago, I think it is an hour ago. Yes, an hour ago. No, 1 minute ago, even worse. 1 minute ago, this new employee, just 3 hours and 59 minutes old in our staff, has this wonderful idea called the Industrial Revolution. And then inside that does an awful lot of things that we can talk about later, but destroys 50% of the world's trees in that last minute. And then in the last 20 seconds, contributes to that since about 1970, I think, if my math is right, and it's a WWF figure, then destroys 69% of the world's biodiversity, the other staff you had on the planet. So you can ask just about any audience, what would you do with that new staff member you just took on 4 hours ago? You'd certainly try and stop what they're doing, and you'd probably try and fire them. So there's even a good Onion headline about that, about sort of human fails as leader of the human of the planet. But I think those three stories, I think, maybe anchor for non-climate, non-environmental people more of a sort of a, this is what's happening, this is what we're worried about, and we'll hopefully get onto the bits. Like, this is what's fixable across climate, people, and nature, and they're all interconnected. I'll leave you with a John Muir quote. I think it's even up in Yale School of the Environment somewhere about like if you tug on something, then you realize it's hitched to everything else in the universe. So these climate, human, nature pieces are all sort of complicatedly interconnected as well.
Thank you, Peter. And so, Sarah, to look at this issue from a more micro issue, how does climate change impact urban areas, such as New York or New York City, and how do urban natural areas reduce the impacts of climate change?
Thank you. Thanks for setting the stage. It's always good to get that context kind of laid. I'm going to actually just start with a little bit of an introduction to kind of what natural areas are, and to sort of back into an answer to your question. I'll say I am a native New Yorker. I grew up in the Bronx and worked for about a decade in the Hudson Valley before attending the School of the Environment, and really didn't have an experience growing up in New York of connecting to the natural world locally or really anywhere else. That wasn't really part of my childhood experience or my adolescent experience, but going to school in far upstate New York gave me this kind of eye-opening sense of how big the state and country are. The first time that I traveled past the Mississippi River, it was the first time I traveled out of the United States, was during college. And it really gave me this kind of sense of just the vastness of the natural environment in a way that growing up within the 5 boroughs, I really didn't have a concept of. And after living and working in a really beautiful part of the Hudson Valley, right at the intersection of the Hudson River Valley and the Catskill Mountains for about a decade, I was approached about the opportunity of creating an organization here in New York City that would look at how to care for the natural environment within the 5 boroughs, using some of the best science and thoughts about climate change and thoughts about the importance of nature for people, but bringing it into, I would argue, the most hyper-urban context that we have anywhere in the United States, here in the 5 boroughs of New York City. And having the opportunity to think about what an organization designed to meet that mission would do and how we would be structured was a really fun opportunity. And it was a chance to really look around the country at how other cities were thinking about this topic. Everything from kind of the leadership model, like how do you raise money and pay for this, but also what do you do in a really intense urban environment when you're thinking about the pressures of housing development and human needs and transportation, and also thinking about that connection to nature and its value. I was surprised to learn during that process that about 40% of the land area of New York City is some form of green, and about 12% is natural habitats, the kinds of intact forest and wetland areas that we think of when we think about places like the Catskills or the Adirondacks, places that have contiguous hundreds or sometimes even thousands of acres of intact functioning ecosystems. And I'll say, kind of pivoting to climate change, I think for New Yorkers, a lot of us, when we think of climate change, think of a big coastal storm event. I think a lot of people kind of climate really came online for them with Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans. And then I think for New Yorkers, anyone who was here during Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy had this life-changing experience of being reminded that we're a city with 520 miles of coastline. We're a city of islands located in a harbor right at the mouth of the Atlantic Ocean. And it really gave us this like, whoa, we are vulnerable to nature. Nature is literally surrounding us. And I think it's been interesting over the last decade to learn that heat is actually the most common killer related to climate change in the United States, not storms. So we see in a place like New York, we had a really, really hot July, but all across the United States, heat is the #1 sort of has the highest sort of human toll of climate within our country. But coastal inundation, inland flooding, so people who were here for Ida and heard about people dying in basements because of flooding in neighborhoods, that's a huge problem. And we're seeing kind of these, secondary and tertiary issues related to impacts on clean water, impacts on air quality, kind of this ratcheting up of the environmental issues that have always existed in the urban environment, but are kind of like we're turning the heat up on those issues as we're literally turning the temperature up on our planet. So I would just say natural areas, so that our sort of natural environment is really an unsung hero in the sort of experience of climate within this city. Our natural areas really do kind of an outsized job of capturing stormwater. About 21% of the stormwater in New York City is captured within our natural areas, even though they represent about 11.5% of our land area. They capture about 85% of carbon that's captured within vegetation within the city, even though they represent, again, only about 10% of our land area. So they play a really outsized role compared to our street trees. They also provide tremendous cooling benefit. And New York City has an initiative underway to expand our tree canopy from 22% to 30%, and really thinking about how we care for our existing urban nature and how we use kind of the palette of the natural world to expand nature for the urban environment as we think creatively about how to address climate change.
And now is kind of a follow-up to that question, and this is for both of you. What do practitioners and policymakers working on a global and local scale have to learn from each other?
You want to go first?
Yes, please.
You'll be, oh, me to
You
go
can go, oh, either
Yeah,
way.
yeah. So what can people learn from each other? I think it's an interesting one because we've been chatting in our leadership course. Yeah, I run a leadership course in the Yale School environment and it's called Perspectives. And the idea of realizing that you have one unique perspective, and that others have valid sort of worldviews too. And that there's a complicated Venn diagram of different sort of sectors that are needed on most solutions. So I would say the first thing that we sort of teach in and coach and agree is that you have to go from self, as in what am I interested in? What's my purpose? What do I want to spend my time engaged with? And look at the people around you. I'd love to hear the co-founding story as part of the answer over here as well. It's like the idea, like who around me cares about the same things that I do, and then teaching people into this to think about the system levels and like what system am I trying to change? Why is that system there in the first place? What of that system is good? What of that system is bad? What's interconnected? The structure, and then how might I change the system, and who needs to change in order for that system to get to a better place? When you're saying about what can we learn from each other, I mean, typically it is just appreciating that you have that one unique view and the others have a very distinct and different set of motivations. And that's where a lot of where I think the cross-sector partnerships are made. But then that's also where a lot, especially in this country, where some of our conversations break down, is that lack of appreciation that there is a whole complex worldview over there that you're listening to. And it's not just, let's be clear, it's not about just like the US either getting it right or wrong in some places. Take the world's forests, for instance, and saving tropical rainforests. It's sort of understanding what the national government is trying to do in development. Go back to that cocktail glass, sort of many of the rainforest nations are down here wanting to develop, but then there's indigenous people that are literally stewarding those very trees. How sort of what is their alternative income or their current income, and then sort of the world's money in terms of carbon credits or donations. It's just like a complex set. So short answer would be like what we're going to learn from each other is almost like everything in terms of like how do you get the people looking at the problem rather than the people looking at each other as the problem.
For this in a slightly different way, but I really appreciate that perspective. I was kind of thinking about what sort of local actors can learn from a global perspective or sort of global team of actors, and was thinking for people, in this room, I know there's folks who are really deeply invested in sort of community scale work, and it's a big job to really embed yourself in a community, to really get to know the people that you're working with, the sort of both biophysical and human community that you're trying to serve if you're in the nonprofit world. And it's really, really valuable to be able to draw on the expertise and tools and policies and kind of learning of the global community so that you can bring that technical knowledge and information and downscale it as a tool for local problem solving without having to be both an expert in how to function in a really complicated and dynamic environment and also bring the best data, the best policy information, kind of lessons learned into that scale. So for me, kind of at that, like working at this more local scale, we rely a lot on tools and resources that are being developed by large think tanks, by large NGOs, by government to inform our local work so that we can do what we know how to do, which is to like really make change at that local scale. We do a lot of our own research as well, but we always start with what's already known about the problems we're trying to tackle and how do we use that as a jumping off point to really kind of create a hyper local impact.
Right. I would love to just chip in and say that like to not underestimate the feedback loop there. That when sort of if global change makers don't work out what is happening on the ground in New York with amazing things happening borough by borough, what is happening on the ground with indigenous people stewarding that tropical rainforest. I'll take my own personal experience. Like we were just chatting before we started here. I'm on Sustainable Westport, tiny little town, 20,000 people just up here, trying to get to net zero. We put the flag in the ground. I have no idea how to get there. And that's potentially overstating the problem. But the idea of just thinking like, how are we going to achieve that as a 20,000 like people community, or 4,000 over here in Jersey, etc. And we can, as Sarah just said, learn from things like the global piece. But in turn, I kind of walk into a room, say that you mentioned in my intro, the UN Race to Zero, and how are we doing net zero targets for companies and cities. And I think me and many others that are in those rooms bring in our sort of, well, we're trying to do this at a small town. And how does that happen? And so that bi-directional piece of learning from local community up to the global and the global back. So it's almost like wherever everyone here is a practitioner, it's just like you can affect this kind of multi-directional flow of information and learning.
And so my next question is, more about leadership in, tackling this issue. And so this question's for you, Peter. And so, you're passionate about leadership generally, but climate leadership in particular. And I'm wondering if you could describe what you think makes a climate leader successful.
Yeah, and I as we were talking earlier, like I bring baggage on this, like I teach it and I coach it, and I get fascinated by it. To the extent I'm promoting a completely free online course on Coursera with Yale. It's just like, so I'm coming with that sort of lens, and I think one of the things we teach is systems thinking is that no systems thinker is neutral. So if you're coming at it and viewing a system, so I'm coming at it from a firm belief that leadership can be taught and any leader can get better from wherever they are. And I even have discussions about that with the Yale faculty, that some people say like, oh, leadership's innate, like we'll teach the finer sets of biology pieces, but they're either a leader or they're not a leader. It's like that's the piece I'm sort of coming in and saying, no, I'm coming in hot going, no, any leader can be better. Leadership can be taught. There's a framework, our frameworks. And then in terms of that, I call my particular sort of view on the world as connected leaders. I think a climate leader, and indeed any leader trying to do social, environmental change with the three sort of pillars of what we were setting up as the problem at the start here, and wants to do something good, is it has to be connected to themselves first. Connected. I code with sort of 4 P's to remember, like purpose. Like must be be able to articulate their purpose and probably question and confirm it too. Like I am here, this is why I'm here, and this sort of centered on purpose. Priorities, to know what to spend time on, to know what's really important and what's not important. Potential, have a view of the future, a clear-eyed view of this is the future I want to create. And then progress, like holding myself to account on, am I getting there? And I find that sort of crudely, those are like 4 fibers of a rope, and the leadership is strong when all 4 P's are centered and mindful for any leader. And across sectors, we find strengths and weaknesses. So somebody crudely might be sort of absolutely sort of higher, sort of high on purpose, but not pulling through to saying, well, what's effective? What's my strategy? Am I getting there? And then others, they sort of clock in for working every day and make millions, but are not anchored to their purpose. So I think sort of being centered on that, I think is almost like the first stage. And then that idea of sort of, there are those tools to kind of go up to the level of team, work out how to get the best out of your team, and then go up to the system and really interrogate what system am I even interested in? And is it at the right scope and scale? And then what can I do with others and with humility to change and improve the system? And often I think in climate leaders, we end up risking climate almost like burnout, because the problem is so big, it's so sort of unsolvable as if you take it in the set of one big sort of wrap. And so getting to the scope and scale of a system that you not only can care about, is say, I might actually be able to make some change here. I think that is something that makes a climate leader successful, is to know their system and sort of put the boundaries around it, and then go in with purpose.
And so leadership is critical also to starting and running a nonprofit organization. And so, Sarah, I'm wondering if you could, what are some lessons that you've learned about effective environmental leadership from your tenure as the executive director of the Natural Areas Conservancy?
Thank you. And yeah, it's nice to kind of hear the like almost more like sort of philosophy or like framing around leadership, and then to kind of contrast that with the like more in the trenches experience. I think that starting a nonprofit is it's a bit of a leap of faith. And I think it's kind of a combination of being really clear about your mission, what you're trying to do, your theory of change, like how you want to move the needle to see progress towards that mission, and then really becoming an expert in the political landscape. And I mean sort of small p political, not necessarily like working in politics, but the sort of ecosystem of organizations and players that you are working with. So I'll say for the Natural Areas Conservancy, we knew when we were launching, my co-founder and I, that there was no organization within New York City that was focused on advancing the care of natural areas. There was a division at the Parks Department that was doing some work in this space. There were organizations working in a lot of individual parks that had caring for natural areas as part of their purview. There were groups that were focused on coastal resilience. There was groups that were focused on parks advocacy. There was like a lot of touch points that related to natural areas, but nobody had said spread across dozens and dozens of communities across the 5 boroughs, more than 70 parks on federal, state, and public city land. We have this resource that is connected ecologically, but sort of spread across our city. How do we reframe and think about this as an asset for the city? How do we think about the people who use these places, not just at that sort of individual park scale, but as a constituency that doesn't currently have a voice? And then what can we do to be effective in that space to make some change? And for us, that has looked like this kind of set of concurrent activities that are really married together. The first is grounding in good science and really understanding the value of these places. So that looked like starting with a citywide ecological assessment to understand just how healthy and diverse our natural areas are. Fun facts, we learned there's 64 different ecological communities within our city's natural areas, support over 2,000 unique species of birds, over 350, of plants, 350 species of birds, over 200 unique species of bees live within New York City's natural areas with this tremendous amount of biodiversity. They're a lot healthier than we thought, but they're also under tremendous stress. We also learned that 50% of New Yorkers have only ever experienced nature within the city's natural area, so have never traveled outside of New York City to have an immersive experience in a national park or a state park or a forest outside of the city. And having that science has allowed us to create these foundational plans about the care of forests, the care of wetlands, and ultimately a plan to outline a 300-mile trail system across about 10,000 acres of city parkland, and has really been this jumping off point to say, like, we really understand these places, we understand what they need, and we can translate that into a set of policy asks and financial asks. It's looked like really understanding how to do advocacy and work with elected officials and with agencies to bring that message forward. It's meant really learning how to work with coalitions. So we do a lot of work with the parks advocates. That's like 200 organizations. They work together around the city's parks budget. We do a lot of work with resilience, and that's a lot of working with like super technical folks that are studying wetland change. Like, they're even geekier on science than we are, but we're like bridging kind of that scientific knowledge with understanding what's possible in government and what might happen this year, what might we plan towards 10 years. And then another piece of the work that I'm really passionate about and proud of is creating a workforce training program. So we learned early on that the natural resources team at Parks was the least diverse division within the city's agency and had the lowest levels of local hiring of that agency, which has almost 10,000 staff if you include seasonal staff. That's because you can't get a degree in New York City that qualifies you for a job at the Parks Department if you want to work in conservation, but you can get a degree locally, and get 1 year of work experience to become eligible. So we created a program that trains students from the City University of New York and basically gets them the combination of coursework and work experience that allows them to enter full-time work. And then the last thing I'll say is kind of expanding. So we built a 12-city national network in 2019, and now have expanded that to 21 cities. And it's a light touch level of involvement. It's like 2 staff people on our team who manage that, but 90% of the people that we talked to around the country said they were not in any regular contact with practitioners outside of their city. They were so hyper-focused in whatever their little kind of local purview was that there was no learning happening. And as we're facing these challenges that are changing the landscapes that we work in so quickly, we're really excited to be able to be kind of this connector across cities and to help people have a full sense of community and camaraderie, and also the chance to share and learn technical skills from each other.
Awesome. So
Yeah.
I have one more question for Sarah and Peter, and then I'd love if we could take some questions from the crowd here in the room and also anyone online if you have questions. And so my last question for you both is, working on climate change can be quite a weighty task. And so I'm wondering if you could tell me, what makes you optimistic about the work that you do? And because we're in a room full of Yale alums and friends and family, what's one thing that Yale alumni, friends, and family can do related to climate change?
Well, I'd say one thing that makes me really optimistic is this program that I just talked about, seeing young people go from kind of, they call it like green blindness. So the idea of like nature just looks like kind of this wall of green, to being able to feel really comfortable and really knowledgeable about their local natural environment, and to then become professionals in this field, or even just to become, sort of ambassadors for the value of urban nature. For me, that has really brought a lot of optimism and enthusiasm. And what can people do? I mean, there's ample opportunities for volunteerism. We host volunteers all the time if you're interested. I would say, so I think that's a great way to get involved. I also think on the sort of burnout piece, spending time enjoying nature is a great way to stay recharged and engaged to keep doing this work. And so I'd say volunteerism, mentorship, certainly for people who are like really interested in the nonprofit world, there's lots of opportunities, and all the way up to board service. But I would say just getting started with some simple engagement that feels like it can kind of fit into your life, I think is the most important starting point.
Right. I got tripped up on this question with the one, but I'm going to try and cheat by piggybacking on answers and then go to my one. So my cheat build would be like, I fundamentally share with Sarah the belief in people in general, but young people especially, to rise up and be leaders on this and do things that, sort of, we all don't have the individual capacity to think how brilliant they can be. But if everyone's brilliant and if everyone's purpose-centered and doing great things, like I believe in people like Sarah does, and I think we have to be if you're in the kind of climate space. You got to believe in the goodness. That was my sneaky build. The one that keeps me optimistic is, and I'm going to draw a super simple graph for climate, almost like climate change solutions on a page, is this like the cost of clean is coming down. So, you take batteries, you take LEDs, you take most solutions around green is this like we're reliably riding a tech curve. And then there's a squiggly, awkward brown sort of curve of dirty, which is it's getting worse and more harmful and more expensive to dig the nasty stuff out of the ground and burn it. So you've got a squiggly upward curve and a smooth green curve, and we're moving just about every sector from the left to the right. And once it goes past the crossover, it doesn't matter what you believe anymore. It's cheaper to be green because the cost of clean is now cheaper. So that's where electric vehicles is getting close, where it's getting to say unsubsidized. We're almost at the crossover, so that we're just going to take off. in a kind of non-linear way on something that just makes sense to people that believe or don't believe. It doesn't really matter anymore on the right. And most things are moving left to right. The piece for climate activists / change makers is to say what's stuck on the, certainly in the business side, is to say what's stuck on the left, how can we move it over to the right? So there's no longer a debate on the stuff. So I see so many sectors making that move, getting close to the crossover, and all these forecasters going, oh, but we thought this, and it's actually up here. You know, take solar, take LEDs, take a bunch of things that we forecasted would take off at X scale, and don't. They take off at much steeper scales because of this move. So that's why I'm optimistic with those two there. And then on the what can we do? I think I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Is like plug in at whatever level you're at. So I love the sort of the co-founding of or founding of nonprofit sort of theories of change is so important, so needed as a sector. But then and volunteering if you're in another sector, but then don't necessarily leave the opportunity to change making your day job off the table too. It's just like, what, sort of choose the employer that makes beliefs, in accordance, moves in accordance with your beliefs. Create a sustainability committee. Sustainability committees in most, sort of corporate say or government. There's like there's cross-cutting kind of groups there. So stay where you are, and then almost like go local if you're in the middle, go global, go national. It's like operate in that sort of as Sarah said, how she found so much inspiration from international think tanks. It's like, well, you might be in a level that can both be inspired by and inspire others. So I think that's the key thing. It's also like be active where you are at. And if you want the tools, do take a free course or a free workshop in the end of climate change. Climate week. We're sitting right in this room on as well. In terms of like how to get some of these leadership tools in play, so that you can think about what's you want to change.
Thank you both, Peter and Sarah, for a wonderful discussion. Before we get into a Q&A, how about a round of applause for them both? Perfect. Awesome. Now we can take questions from anyone in the room. If anyone has a quick hands.
This is how can your nonprofits based in your city work with your organization? What's our way of introducing ourselves?
Easiest way to send me an email. We do host volunteers from organizations and individuals, so be happy to talk about opportunities to partner with organizations for sure.
I guess for the meeting, first of all, are you guys connected to the AIA? Do you talk to the American Institute of Architects about what you're doing and collaborate? We have around 15,000 members in New York, so it's a pretty prodigious group. We have 24 committees, all of whom are involved in some way, shape, or form in the environment since we build stuff. But that's a general invitation to both of you. But I wanted to know also, so Sarah, when did you start your organization? Because I don't recall you saying it. And then how many people are in it? And then how did this get funded? Just generally.
Yeah, we launched the organization in June of 2012 after about a 2-year planning process. I'd say we had a really slightly unusual and really fortuitous launch story, which is that a foundation actually approached the Parks Department about the idea of funding, like providing seed funding to an idea that would help advance. They're a conservation funder that would help advance conservation in New York City. And the then Parks Commissioner came up with essentially an early version of this concept. And I had the opportunity to be hired with that planning grant to write the plan. So it was, for somebody who's a little risk adverse, I'd say it was like a really nice way to look into kind of a founding role. And when we launched, we were 100% foundation funded, and it's been a big and, kind of steadfast part of the job as an executive director is thinking about how to sustain and diversify funding. So right now we're at about 2/3 of our funds come from foundations and about 1/3 comes from individuals and corporate support. We have 25 full-time staff, and we work with about 30 seasonal staff and interns each year.
Yeah.
Thank you very so much for that talk. I love also the different altitudes you were talking about. It was really stimulating. I also like the squiggly lines you were talking about. And I had a question about that, which was, I want to make sure I'm getting it right first of all. You sort of, I'm inferring there's kind of there's a sort of point of no return at which companies will get to, at which point, like it is, as you say, cheaper to be greener. Is that fair, first of all, or was I misinterpreting what you were saying about the squiggly lines?
What I was saying was like take a technology, like I was thinking it more on a technology like internal combustion engine to electric vehicle, and that sort of transition. You if you're talking about like at a corporate level, or to take a way to power electricity to say solar or renewables, but at a corporate level, you're adding an interesting level of complexity because there's the pieces that are sort of typically in the efficiency space, which is like use less and you're going to save more. There's typically that sort of cream skim idea, like we'll get those things that are easy or low hanging fruit, other analogy there. And then there's a sort of this big middle space of, I think what's needed is a C-suite or sort of, and actually even it helps when it's very sort of from the top saying, we want to get to, sort of net zero, or we want to get there, but let's work out how to. And that's much easier than a sort of, let's do what we can that makes sense to go greener. Or even worse is the compliance, like let's do what we can to stay out of trouble because like that's what's needed in our industry to stay out of trouble. And so if you take that middle space of something approaching a sustainability vision and a net zero vision, then that unlocks an enormous amount of ingenuity typically. And they can find new customer bases, and there's, sort of, they find massive positive spillovers. Like, oh, this new section of the population actually likes us because we are positive about X or whatever. And then there's this typically a sort of a back 5 to 10%. Let's take the, and like say Google and Microsoft sort of saying, we want to be 100% sort of 24/7 fossil fuel free energy. That last 5 to 10% is incredibly hard and incredibly expensive. And so you'll find a lot of that pieces of like easy stuff at the front, using less. And then there's this middle bit that needs commitment. And I would argue, just as Sarah launched a nonprofit, like a strong sense of purpose. What I see sort of sustainability teams having a purpose, but they don't have a dock into the organization's main purpose. It's like, oh, that's part of the main vision. Then that's hard as well. But then you've got this main bit, and then you've got this hard bit for everybody. At that like, how do you get to 24/7 zero, real zero?
Yeah. What's the question?
First of all, thank you so much for talking today. It was really lovely listening to you and like the evocative imagery that you used. So one question I had for the both of you, feel free to answer in whatever way you feel comfortable, is like, what's an instance in your climate work where you've had to compromise? And then how did that help you elucidate like general principles on how to compromise well, just general?
I think a really tangible example, we released this first ever 25-year plan for the care of forested natural areas in 2018. And we were like, we know what we need, and we shopped it around. We actually got the city council to hold a special hearing about it. We got like 30 groups to come out and testify about it. And I think we were asking for $10 million a year to start, and they gave us $2.5 million. They gave parks $2.5 million to like launch the first year. And it was a real letdown in some ways. And I remember the commissioner at the time was like, you need to call it a win, and you need to make a big deal about it as a win, even though you're really disappointed, because you just went from nothing to something, and that's a win. And the fact that you took 2 years and you like really thought if you told the story correctly, you could get all the way to, full implementation in year one. That's not really how it works. And I was like, whatever, we tried so hard. And I think that for me, that would be like really had to like reframe for myself and then for our staff. Like it's forever work. It's not really a campaign or a work that has like a single endpoint that we'll get to. It's caring for a natural system is never going to be over. And so you have to kind of think about this balance of like turning it into a set of kind of like short-term things that you can work on and hopefully make progress on, but without feeling disappointed if you get it all done at once.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad I was second, because because I think compromise is such a tricky word. Because it's both got a fundamental truth in just about every position. There's a wonderful in a systems thinking course I do, we bring in Indigenous ways of knowing and she's called a relational systems thinking scholar in, and she's this wonderful phrase about there's always a sacred space in the middle. And so that idea of like just about everything has a sacred space in the middle. And so I immediately go to your compromise and go, what do you mean? Like, what's the context? Because if it's like seeking the sacred space in the middle, it's like always, like every day, like this, this conversation, our balance of airtime, whatever it is, it's like there's always something to shoot for that wasn't what you thought to start with. But then a piece where you never, I would hope, compromise or at least have a fight or flight response is on where your values are asked to be compromised, and then knowing what those values are, and that's sort of almost like another place to take the word compromise. And then I went to sort of when was a moment. I coach as well as teach. I don't know too many lecturers can just lecture, and so I coached before I joined Yale. I'm almost a reverse academic, if you will, and unfortunately not an alumni. It's a real shame. But some of my coaching compromises, like I sometimes get a commodities person or a doctor that's not going to ever do climate, but is doing some great stuff. But say, take the commodities one, which is more of a compromise in my internal ways. Like they might be trading oil as well as corn, as well as this, as well as that. Do I coach that person? Do I try and make them a better person and a better leader? And that's almost like an internal one with me that says, yeah, I think so, because I believe in their humanity, and they might take this and go off and realize that climate change is a thing to go fight for. But that's like an inner compromise of like taking on that client when I know they're currently, if I make them better in the short term, they might be trading more oil or maybe more bad things. But I'm hoping that a better human sort of results at the end. And then sometimes my last one was when you heard, sometimes I think a lot of us in the climate field, the compromise that we can should take the 2.5 million becomes 10. The compromise is time and waiting, not necessarily ultimately a compromise. It's like I often try and advise from the outside. I go, and immediately I come out and go, this is going to take longer than I thought for minds to move, strategies to form, whatever it is I'm being asked to help them with. But that's not really a compromise. That's just patience, I think, sometimes as well. But patience with what's Christiana Figueres' thing, stubborn optimism. You've got to keep pushing as well. I can't just go, I've just got patience. Like, no, I've got to keep pushing as well as be patient.
Follow-up question I also want to give. Okay. I'm so sorry. When I was thinking about compromise, I was thinking specifically about this building in Georgia Tech's campus. It's a living building. So the Living Building Challenge is aiming to be like the most rigorous certification for buildings. So think LEED, but more intensive almost. And it's a yearly thing. So it's seeking to make like a building almost a part of the environment itself cyclically. So I was speaking to one of the managers of the building there, and she said, one thing that's really frustrating being in this climate field is like a lot of people think that if it's not 100% quote unquote sustainable, then it's not worth it. So if we use this plastic instead of like maybe this other more harmful like metal-based material, then people are like, oh, but what about microplastics? So I think when I was thinking about compromise, I was thinking about that kind of continuous sort of cost benefit analysis. But I would also love to hear more about the sacred space in the middle, because that just sounds delightful. I would love to hear more about that.
Sacred space in the middle.
There you go. Okay. It came from actually I presume quite a tense time, the story that I've heard, which is sort of settlers with the river that's in the middle, and how does the settlers and the indigenous that were there beforehand used the river. And the initial thought of like almost like another concepts that are related and interesting are like power over rather than power with. And so the power to achieve something together and achieve that this river is something that we both rely on. But that was where that initial story came from, was the indigenous people realizing that this won't be their home exclusively anymore, and that they had to work out something with these people that weren't going to go away. But that actually the end result could be better. Now there was, sort of in that particular example or not, but the idea that it's something that's always worth chasing has stayed with me since I heard the story. Like in just about any place. In terms of your compromise on like sort of building choice, it sounds like we've got the AIA over here to help us navigate the sort of the niche, the nuances of the compromise. But I think
You clearly haven't been to the AIA. It's a fully lay leadership organization, so it's 25 committees are supported by just lay leaders, and then there's support staff. I mean, it's a big support staff, but we are an unusual group in the United States. We're the largest.
that sort of building choices, I imagine there's lots of big projects where there's compromises almost at every stage to get to that balance of cost. And as I said earlier to that other question, like the piece, like how far you can get with the sort of the middle of the bell curve, like we're almost getting to zero, but then that chasing that piece that's the piece that I wrestle with in climate change quite a lot, actually, is this like, and we're playing it out in the world stage on net zero, like are offsets / carbon credits allowed? It's really, I think it's a really tricky debate, because sort of, does Microsoft use all its money in to get to that 24/7 fossil free, or that building is absolutely sustainable, but then those dollars could have gone over here to save X much more tons, and that country now has a reason to keep trees alive rather than dead. Sort of, so there's sort of nuances and compromises everywhere.
Yes, and by the way, that Yale is one of the only universities right now that has a program between the forestry, SOM, and the School of Architecture. So there is you can get a degree in I don't know how many years and whatever it takes, but students are, and there's when I was in school, there was not the cross pollination, but there's a real effort. And there's actually something called mass timber, which is the most exciting thing. Actually, graduated like 3 years ahead of me. One of the foremost researchers in mass timber is Yale, and he's done some great work.
So we are at time here, but I do want to get maybe 1 or 2 more questions from the crowd. And then for those of us in the room, if you want to head down to the main lounge after we wrap up, feel free to join us for cocktails and drinks. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, I was wondering, just to one of the points you made recently about how like protecting an ecosystem is sort of ongoing work. I was curious, like, yes, that's true, but also you're an organization, you have to fundraise, you have to have milestones, you have to be able to show what progress or like success looks like in the context of, the work of protecting an ecosystem. You mentioned some of those stats that you had researched when you were first starting the organization, interesting learnings about, 50% of New Yorkers not really experiencing nature inside of the city, and just like all these really interesting insights into the status of the ecosystem when you were first starting. So I was curious if you've been able to measure changes are you still looking at those, same statistics? Have those evolved? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, we're actually, thank you. That's a great question. We're in the middle right now of remeasuring 10 years later the health of those same places. So we are, we'll do data collection for a couple more months this season, and then we'll spend this fall and winter looking at change over time, so that we can start to think about the trajectory that we're on. And that's that's sort of super exciting for us, because it's one thing to be able to kind of capture a moment in time, but you don't know if that moment in time is on the way up or on the way down, or what the factors are that are influencing it. So having those sort of 2 points across such a big landscape is something we're really excited to have to check out next year. We're going to have some updated information to share.
Very cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both very much. This is incredible, and seeing the dichotomy between the two of you and your roles as well is really just perfect. I have a question for Sarah that kind of dips into your systems thinking side of things as well. Thinking about the way that when we're doing systems thinking, everything is connected. All these actors in the system are all working together, whether they know it or not. When we're talking about trying to identify natural spaces as assets, is there any concern that there's an opportunity for that to be co-opted as a marketization tool, in the sense that when you're beginning to assign a value to these spaces in order to convince people that they're important and they should be protected, it puts a number on it in terms of what it costs to take that space and turn it into something else. Is there any concern about that approach that is getting co-opted?
That's a great question. I'll actually say we had hoped through quantification that we might be able to actually enter a marketplace as a way of raising funds to expand protection and management. New York in particular is really expensive, and the price point, all of those stacked values are still, I would say it's complicated. Maybe what I'll say is it's complicated. You can sort of stack up what all those different values are together and get like a really big number, but who cares about the different parts of that number are really different players. And so we are fortunate that a lot of the land that we research and work on is technically protected in that it's in some sort of public ownership. We actually, the thing that we worry about more are two things. One is conversion within kind of that natural landscape into something else. So like the conversion of a forest into, there was a proposal to make a big cricket pitch up in Van Cortlandt Park. So like from one type of parkland to another type of parkland. But the other thing we worry about a lot is just degradation. So not so much that it's going to get raised and turned into a condo, but that it will go from being, you know, an intact oak forest that supports dozens of different species to being just a field of vines that has a lot lower value and is really hard to revert back to. And I think kind of to that ecosystem point, it's really hard to recreate a fully functional ecosystem. There's a lot that there's like all the ingredients, and then there's like the magic of nature working, and it's really hard to rebuild that. And so we are always starting with protecting, kind of restoring, and then where it's appropriate, kind of building from scratch.
I can chip in quickly on the system thing, because I think a tropical forest version of what you just said is like, I think the problem is that nature doesn't have a number. So that logging has a number, crops has a number, beef has a number. All the drivers of deforestation have a number, but the value of the standing tree doesn't have a number. So I would sort of flip it and go, I think that's the biggest problem in quite a lot of that. And just to echo that sort of the international version on Sarah's on the tropical side, it's just like when you destroy that 100-year growth, it's like it's the hydrology, it's the global cooling effect, it's the medicinal, it's the life, it's the biodiversity within it. There's so many pieces that are destroyed at the same time because it doesn't have a number. The other bit is just like it's just like carbon is just one number that I think we're not going to get high enough. And so can we get to the value of an acre for all those amazing benefits that we realize that these things provide, as opposed to sort of one unit? I think that's in terms of the system. Last thing on the system thought is, so what we teach in, and it's nice to maybe think about it, is system as an iceberg. You see that the dots in time, as Sarah said, underneath the surface is the trend. And it's like, oh, look at that. We're going up, we're going down, we're going around. That's good to know. And you have to peer beneath the surface. Underneath that is the rules of the game. How are things actually connected? And then underneath that is the belief in that really drives the system. And it feels like I've just learned so much, like you guys listening to Sarah now, is it's like that idea of almost like maybe the belief is like, this is a concrete jungle that I can't get out of type thing, to that there's an amazing amount of nature and space, and it's worth protecting, or whatever that, like if we have the belief change, then the rest of the system changes that much easier. That piece that's furthest from the surface of an iceberg is also, in system thinking, is the most powerful way to change that system.
Well, thank you, Peter and Sarah. How about Alvin? Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for those of us online who could join us tonight too. And so now we'll head down to the main lounge. Feel free to stick around if you're able to join us for cocktails.
Thank you. I am the beach region, I'm on the board of Ghana. Thanks everybody for coming. For anybody that's interested, on September the 4th, Abby Dillon, who is the head of First Justice, who was in my class in 94, giving a talk, a Zoom talk, about the work they do and similar topics. I encourage everybody to attend. If anybody wants info, I'm happy to give you guys the Zoom link or enjoy it.
Will you be sending out?
I think we might be sending something on the.
That's the whole thing.
Yeah. But it's a little bit lackluster. It's hosted by Bill Green and class of 94.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, doing some great work. An organization called First Justice that advocates on behalf of the earth. That's legal work. Yes, they will be able to do that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for
Thanks for hosting.
hosting. Thank you.